You have been a Pippleton for all 34 years of your life, and this morning you rose before the sun did what you have always done. You washed your face with cold water from the clay basin in your room at Moctezuma's palace. You dressed in your tilmatli, the fine cotton mantle that marks your rank. You ate maize cakes prepared by a woman whose name you have known since childhood. The city of Tenochtitlan opened around you the way it always does. 100,000 people waking, the causeways filling, the smell of copal smoke rising from the temple platforms into the pale morning sky. You have catalogued everything about the strangers that could be catalogued. You have done this with the precision of a man trained in the ritual calendar, in the measurement of celestial bodies, in the keeping of records that must survive generations. What you have not yet catalogued is what this morning means. You do not know, as you finish your maize cakes and set down the clay cup, that you are living inside the last weeks of everything you have ever understood to be permanent. The strangers arrived 4 months ago on the eastern coast, and the first reports came to Tenochtitlan the way all reports came, through runners, through the relay system that could move information from the coast to the capital in a handful of days. The reports were strange enough that the scribes reached for the old categories: men from the sea, men with floating mountains for boats, men with animals that carried them at great speed. You were one of the scholars given the task of making sense of the accounts, and you approached it the way you had been trained to approach any problem that required understanding. Systematically, without panic, with the confidence that the frameworks you possessed were adequate to any new information that might be placed inside them. You catalogued the horses. You noted the metal that deflected obsidian. You observed the dogs bred to the size of small jaguars and the weapons that made thunder and smoke and could kill from a distance that made the killing feel almost supernatural. You sent detailed reports to Moctezuma's advisors. The reports were good reports. They were accurate. What they failed to account for, because you had no category for it, because no category for it existed in any codex you had ever studied, was what you saw 3 days ago on the eastern shore. You were present when Cortez ordered his ships burned. You need to sit with that for a moment, because the mind, when it encounters something with no precedent, tends to move past it quickly rather than feel the full weight of it. 11 ships, every vessel. He ordered his own men to take axes to the hulls of every ship that had brought them here, and you watched from the shore as the wood caught and the smoke rose over the water in thick columns that you could still smell on your clothes the following morning. You have fought wars your entire life. Aztec wars, flower wars, the kind of war with rules that have been negotiated over generations. Wars fought to take prisoners for the gods. Wars fought with ritual timing and understood purposes. Wars that ended when enough blood had been offered. You have never, in 34 years of scholarship and observation and careful cataloging, seen a commander destroy his own means of retreat. It is not a thing that is done. It is not even a thing that is imagined, because a commander who destroys his own retreat has not made a tactical decision. He has made a statement about the nature of his intention. These men are not here to negotiate trade agreements. These men are not here to establish the kind of relationship that can be managed and maintained and turned to Tenochtitlan's advantage. These men burn their ships because they have decided that the only direction available to them is forward. And you are standing at the water's edge watching the smoke rise, and something in your chest has understood something that your mind is only now beginning to articulate. You walk back through the causeways toward the palace, and you notice for the first time things you have looked at for 34 years without truly seeing. The width of the causeways, the drawbridges that can be raised to isolate sections of the city, the way Tenochtitlan sits in the middle of the lake, surrounded by water on all sides, accessible only through the 3 great causeways that you have crossed your entire life without thinking about them as strategic features, rather than simply as the way you got from one place to another. You are beginning to do a different kind of calculation. You're beginning to look at your city the way someone might look at it who was trying to take it. The causeways that protected you from invasion by land are also the causeways that would trap you inside if those exits were controlled. The lake that made Tenochtitlan unconquerable is also the thing that makes it an island. You have always known this. You have simply never needed to think about it as a problem rather than as a geographical fact. The strangers move through the empire with an ease that you cannot fully account for. This is the thing that your reports have not adequately conveyed, and that you are only now understanding in your body rather than simply in your intellect. Everywhere they go, they are finding people who hate Tenochtitlan. This should not surprise you. The empire that your grandfather helped build is an empire sustained by tribute, by the constant extraction of goods and labor, and the regular demand for human hearts for the gods. The Tlaxcalans have fought Tenochtitlan for generations. The Totonacs on the coast submitted to the strangers within weeks of their arrival because submission to the strangers seemed more survivable than continued submission to you. You knew this in an abstract way. You knew that the empire had enemies. What you did not fully understand, what you are only now beginning to feel in the particular sickness that comes when something you believed about the world turns out to be smaller than you thought it was, is that those enemies exist in numbers large enough to constitute an army. The strangers are not an invading force of 400 men in metal. They are 400 men in metal at the center of a coalition that is still forming, still growing, absorbing every grievance your empire has generated over 100 years of expansion. You built this, the empire built this, and now it is walking toward Tenochtitlan in a column you can see from the temple platforms on a clear day. Moctezuma has allowed them into the city. This is the fact that lives at the center of everything, and that you cannot make sense of regardless of how many frameworks you apply to it. They came through the southern causeway, and Moctezuma went out to meet them in his litter, carried by his lords, his feet not touching the ground as they always did not touch the ground. And he greeted Cortez with the ceremonies appropriate to a great and respected visitor. And he brought them into the palace that had belonged to his father, and he gave it to them to live in. You were present. You watched it. And you have spent every hour since trying to understand it through every interpretive system available to you, the omens that preceded their arrival, the possibility that Cortez is the returning god Quetzalcoatl, which you believe in the way that a trained scholar believes things, carefully, provisionally, with the understanding that belief and certainty are not the same, the political calculations that might make welcoming the strangers more advantageous than fighting them at the causeway. None of these frameworks settles the thing in your chest that began at the shore when you watched the ships burn. None of them explains why, when you look at the strangers moving through your city now, you feel something that your language does not have a precise word for. The specific sensation of standing inside a structure you have trusted your whole life and feeling, for the first time, the floor shift. You are in the palace the night Moctezuma is taken. You are not in the room where it happens, but you hear the sounds of it moving through the building, the way sounds move through a structure that has suddenly changed its character. Differently, with a quality that makes you stop walking in the corridor outside and stand very still. The strangers have moved from being guests to being captors, and the transition happened so quickly that the palace has not yet adjusted to what it is now. The guards at the entrances are still Aztec guards at Aztec entrances. The protocols are still Aztec protocols. But the emperor of the greatest power in this world is being held inside his own home by 400 strangers, and the mathematical fact of this, the pure impossible arithmetic of it, is what you stand in the corridor absorbing. You are a man trained in the keeping of records that must survive generations. You understand, in this moment, in this corridor, that the record you are living inside has just changed its nature in a way that will take generations to fully understand. The floor shifted. Here is what was underneath it. You go out onto the platform before dawn and look at the city. 100,000 people still sleeping. The temples still standing. The markets that will open at sunrise still dark and waiting. Tenochtitlan is the greatest city you have ever seen or will see. The greatest city most people in this world will ever see. The Venice of the Western Hemisphere, the city that floats, the city with Chinampa's gardens and aqueducts and schools and a legal code and a market at Tlatelolco that Spanish soldiers who have seen the markets of Seville will later describe as larger and more organized than anything in Europe. You stand on the platform and you look at it, and you know two things simultaneously. The first is that this city is real and enormous and will not simply cease to exist. The second is that what is coming is not conquest in the way conquest has always worked. An exchange of ruling powers, a new tribute taker, a continuity of the ordinary life lived underneath the politics. What came off those ships and what has been gathering in the hills around the valley is something you have no category for, and the absence of a category is itself the answer. The men who burned their ships behind them did not come to rule what exists here. You see this now. You see it the way you see a thing when it is too late to do anything with the seeing except hold it. They came to replace what exists here with something so different that there is no word in your language for the shape of what is coming. You are standing on the platform in the dark before dawn, looking at the greatest city in the Western world, and you are doing the only thing left to do. You are remembering it. You are fixing every detail, the smell of the lake, the particular silence of the causeways before the first light, the sound of the city beginning to wake, inside yourself, in the place where the things that must survive are kept. You are a Pippleton. You are trained for this. You have kept records your entire life. You are keeping one now. You do not leave the palace for 3 days after Moctezuma is taken. The strangers have not barred the doors to the Aztec lords and scholars who live and work inside these walls, but the fact of not leaving is itself a kind of knowledge. The knowledge that the world outside the palace has changed in ways you are not yet prepared to confirm with your own eyes. You have heard the accounts from the runners who still come and go. You know that the strangers have been sending messages to the coast, that more ships have arrived, that the men coming off those ships are not the same kind of men as the ones Cortez led here, rougher, more desperate, the kind of men produced by a place that exports its most dangerous. You know that the Allied forces in the hills are larger now than they were a month ago. You know that the city that has never been successfully besieged is being slowly, carefully surrounded by people who grew up inside the Empire and learned, in the bones of their tribute-paying lives, exactly where the weak points were. What you do not know, sitting in the room you have occupied in this palace since you were 19 years old, surrounded by the codices that represent the accumulated knowledge of a civilization, is what the record will look like when someone reads it 100 years from now. You know how to write history forward. You have been trained in the systems that carry information across generations. The codices, the oral traditions, the careful keeping of dates and lineages, and the accounts of battles and agreements and celestial observations. What you cannot write is what comes after the end of the writing system itself. You cannot record what happens when the men who burn ships arrive at the place where the codices are kept. You cannot record the silence after the burning. You can only record this, that you were here, that you saw it, that you understood enough of it to know that what you were seeing was the kind of thing that only happens once, and that once it happens, there is no version of the story in which the world that existed before it is still the world that exists after. The lake is blue this morning. The herons are at the edge of the Shinampas the way they always are. A child somewhere in the city is being taught the same counting system you were taught at her age, the system that has tracked celestial time for hundreds of years, the system that will not be taught much longer in this form, in this place. You close the codex in your hands. You have been a keeper of records your entire life, and you understand, as well as any person who has ever lived inside a civilization can understand while still inside it, what it means when the records stop. It does not mean that the people stop. The people do not stop. They continue, changed and grief-carrying and adapting, into a future they will build from whatever survives. What stops is the specific shape of the thing that was. The roads and the temples and the aqueducts will be taken apart or built over. The calendar will be suppressed. The language will survive but altered, mixed, carrying the weight of what happened to it. Your grandchildren will live in a world that contains no memory of this morning. The blue lake, the herons, the child being taught to count in the old way. You sitting here with the codex in your hands, knowing that the ships have already burned and that the only direction available to the men who burned them is forward, and that forward is here. You are 34 years old. You are a Pippleton, educated, fluent in the ritual calendar, trained in the keeping of records that must survive generations. You close the codex, you open the door. The city is still there.